Did you know Florida has a town that's entirely underwater? Or that it has an island made entirely of shells built by ancient people? How about the fact that Florida sits on a massive limestone sponge that's slowly dissolving beneath your feet? Well, Florida is packed with wild, surprising, and sometimes unbelievable geography facts like these. So buckle up because we're about to explore 50 wild facts about Florida you never knew. Let's start with the basics. Florida, as we know it today, is actually a relatively young piece of land. Geologically speaking, the entire state is basically a giant limestone platform that emerged from ancient ocean floors. Just a few million years ago, most of Florida was underwater, and during ice ages when sea levels dropped, the peninsula was nearly twice as wide as it is now. The whole state sits on this porous limestone foundation that's been building up for millions of years from the compressed skeletons of marine creatures. So when you're standing in Florida, you're essentially on top of a massive calcium carbonate raft that decided to poke its head above the waves. The peninsula didn't have to exist at all, and honestly, the way things are going with rising sea levels, it might not stick around forever. Fact 49, the southernmost point isn't actually the southernmost point. Here's a fun one that'll make you question everything. That famous buoy marker in Key West that says southernmost point of the continental USA? It's a lie. Well, not exactly a lie, more like a strategic geographic fib. The actual southernmost point of the continental United States is on Ballast Key, a private island that you can't visit. So the marker in Key West is technically the southernmost point you can drive to and take a selfie at, which is apparently what matters. The whole thing is brilliantly marketed tourism genius. Thousands of people wait in line every single day to take photos at a spot that's technically not even the real thing. It's about a mile and a half off, but who's counting? The real southernmost point sits on private property, which means geography loses to capitalism once again. Fact 48, Florida has 2 time zones. If you've ever driven across Florida from Pensacola to Jacksonville, you might have noticed something weird happening to your phone. That's because Florida can't even agree with itself about what time it is. The Panhandle, basically everything west of the Apalachicola River, sits in Central Time, while the rest of the state lives in Eastern Time. This creates all sorts of confusion for people who don't realize they're losing or gaining an hour just by driving across the same state. It's especially fun when you're trying to catch a flight or make a dinner reservation, and you forget which side of the invisible timeline you're on. The divide exists because the Panhandle is geographically and culturally closer to Alabama and the rest of the Gulf Coast, so it makes sense in theory. In practice, it just means Florida is the only state on the East Coast that needs 2 clocks. Fact 47, the Everglades are a river, not a swamp. Everyone calls the Everglades a swamp, but that's like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. The Everglades is actually a river, and not just any river. It's a river of grass, 60 miles wide and in some places only 6 inches deep, flowing at the glacial pace of about 100 feet per day from Lake Okeechobee down to Florida Bay. The Seminole people called it Pei-hi-o-kai, which means grassy water, and that's exactly what it is. This slow-motion river covers about 1.5 million acres and creates one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet. It's so flat and so wide that you can't even tell water is moving unless you watch very, very carefully. Calling it a swamp does it a massive disservice. It's more like a sheet flow wetland system that happens to be crawling with alligators, which admittedly doesn't sound much better. Fact 46, Florida's highest point is a joke. Let's talk about Britton Hill, Florida's most underwhelming geographic feature. At 345 feet above sea level, it's the lowest high point of any state in America. To put that in perspective, the high point of Delaware is still higher, at 448 feet. Britton Hill is located in the Panhandle near the Alabama border, and if you weren't looking for it, you'd drive right past without noticing. There's a marker and a small monument, but otherwise, it's just a gentle rise in someone's backyard that happens to be the tallest point in the entire state. You could climb it in flip-flops without breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, states like Colorado have high points over 14,000 feet where people need oxygen tanks and climbing gear. Florida's geography is so aggressively flat that even its biggest hill barely qualifies as a bump. Fact 45, the Gulf Stream keeps Miami warm. There's a reason Miami feels like a different planet compared to the rest of the East Coast, and it's all thanks to the Gulf Stream. This powerful ocean current flows north along Florida's east coast, just a few miles offshore, carrying warm water from the tropics. It's like a giant conveyor belt of heat that keeps South Florida's waters bathed in warmth year-round. While people in New York are dealing with snow and ice in January, Miamians are swimming in 75-degree water. The Gulf Stream is so close to shore that if you're a strong swimmer, you could theoretically swim out and feel the temperature change as you cross into the current. This current doesn't just affect water temperature either. It moderates the entire climate of South Florida, making winters mild and giving the region its tropical feel. Without the Gulf Stream, Miami would just be hot Georgia. Fact 44. More coastline than California. Here's something that doesn't make sense until you look at a map. Florida has 350 miles of coastline, making it second only to Alaska in total beach length. California, which is literally twice as long as Florida, has less coastline. How is that possible? It all comes down to shape. Florida has the Atlantic on one side, the Gulf of Mexico on the other, and thousands of inlets, bays, islands, and peninsulas that add up fast. California has one mostly straight coast. Florida's geography is basically designed to maximize beach access, with water on three sides and a shape that creates endless opportunities for shoreline. Every coastal twist, every barrier island, every bay adds more miles to the total. So while California gets all the credit for being the beach state, Florida is quietly sitting on more sand than anyone except Alaska. Fact 43, the lightning capital of America. Central Florida, particularly the quarter between Tampa and Orlando, holds a title nobody asked for. It's the lightning capital of the United States. During summer months, afternoon thunderstorms roll in with such predictable regularity that you could set your watch by them. The combination of humid air, heating from the sun, and sea breezes colliding from both coasts creates perfect conditions for massive thunderstorms that light up the sky like a war zone. Florida gets more cloud-to-ground lightning strikes per square mile than anywhere else in the country. Some areas near Tampa average over 100 thunderstorm days per year. It's so common that locals don't even flinch when lightning cracks across the sky. Tourists, however, tend to lose their minds. The state averages about 10 lightning deaths per year, which is more than any other state. So when you're in Florida and you hear thunder, get inside. Fact 42, Florida Bay has 800 square miles of seagrass. Between the southern tip of the mainland and the Florida Keys sits Florida Bay, a shallow basin that's home to one of the largest seagrass beds in the world. About 800 square miles of underwater meadows stretch across the bay, creating a nursery for fish, shrimp, lobster, and countless other marine species. Seagrass might not sound exciting, but it's the foundation of the entire coastal ecosystem. These underwater plants filter water, produce oxygen, prevent erosion, and provide food and shelter for everything from tiny seahorses to massive sea turtles. The problem is, seagrass is incredibly sensitive to water quality, temperature, and light. When pollution or algae blooms cloud the water, the seagrass dies, and everything that depends on it suffers. Florida Bay's seagrass beds have been declining for decades, which means the entire food web is unraveling. But hey, at least it looks pretty from the overseas highway. Fact 41, the state is sinking. Here's a fun geological fact that should concern anyone who owns property in Florida. The entire state sits on a limestone foundation that's slowly dissolving. Florida's bedrock is porous limestone, and when groundwater seeps through it, the limestone dissolves, creating underground cavities. Eventually, these cavities collapse, forming sinkholes. And sinkholes in Florida don't mess around. They can open up suddenly and swallow houses, cars, roads, and in one tragic case in 2013, a man who was sleeping in his bedroom. The state averages several sinkhole incidents every year, and there's really no way to predict where the next one will appear. Some are small, just a few feet across. Others are massive, like the 2013 sinkhole in Seffner that was 50 feet wide. The dissolution of Florida's foundation is ongoing and unstoppable, which means the whole state is perpetually one rainstorm away from turning into Swiss cheese. Fact 40. Alligators in every county. Here's something that should make you think twice before moving to Florida. Every single one of the state's 67 counties has alligators. Not some counties, not most counties. All of them. There is literally nowhere in Florida where you're safe from the possibility of encountering a prehistoric reptile that's been perfecting the art of eating things for 37 million years. They're in golf course ponds, retention basins, drainage ditches, swimming pools, and occasionally someone's garage. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission estimates there are about 1.3 million alligators living in the state, which means there's roughly one gator for every 16 people. They've been found in every imaginable body of water, from the Everglades to suburban backyards in Tampa. The state gets about 7,000 nuisance alligator complaints every year from people who are shocked to discover that living in a swamp means sharing it with apex predators. But hey, at least they're scared of humans. Usually. Fact 39. The Keys are ancient coral reefs. When you're driving down the overseas highway enjoying the view, you're actually cruising over millions of years of geological history. The Florida Keys are the fossilized remains of ancient coral reefs that formed when sea levels were much higher. The upper Keys, from Key Largo down to Big Pine Key, are made of Key Largo limestone, which is essentially fossilized coral from reefs that thrived about 125,000 years ago. The lower Keys are made of Miami oolite, a different type of limestone formed in shallow seas. Either way, you're literally driving on top of compressed marine life that's older than human civilization. When you cross the 7-mile bridge, you're passing over what used to be a living, thriving coral reef ecosystem that got caught above water when sea levels dropped. It's like driving through a marine graveyard that decided to become a tourist destination. The rock is so full of ancient coral and mollusk fossils that you can see them in building materials throughout the Keys. Fact 38. No natural lakes in South Florida. If you've spent any time in South Florida, you've probably noticed lakes everywhere. Housing developments are built around them. Parks are named after them, and they're absolutely central to the landscape. Here's the thing though, almost none of them are natural. Nearly every lake you see in South Florida is man-made, either dug out as borrow pits during construction, created by mining operations, or excavated to provide fill dirt for development. The entire landscape south of Lake Okeechobee is essentially an elaborate construction project designed to make swampland habitable. Some lakes were created when limestone was mined for building materials, leaving behind deep pits that filled with water. Others were intentionally dug as part of neighborhood developments, because people apparently need to live near water even when the entire state is surrounded by it. The result is a completely artificial geography that looks natural but is actually one of the most engineered landscapes in America. Fact 37. The Treasure Coast really has treasure. The stretch of Florida's east coast from Sebastian Inlet down to Palm Beach isn't called the Treasure Coast for marketing purposes. It actually has treasure. In 1715, a Spanish fleet of 11 ships loaded with gold, silver, and jewels was caught in a hurricane off the coast and sank, scattering millions of dollars worth of treasure along the ocean floor. And here's the wild part. That treasure is still washing up on beaches after major storms. Beachcombers regularly find gold coins, silver pieces, and artifacts from the wreck just sitting in the sand after hurricanes churn up the ocean floor. Professional salvage operations have recovered millions of dollars worth of treasure over the decades, but experts believe there's still plenty down there. The 1715 fleet disaster turned this coastline into a legitimate treasure hunting ground, and people still walk the beaches with metal detectors hoping to strike it rich. It's one of the few places where finding actual Spanish gold is a reasonable possibility. Fact 36. Dry tortugas are neither dry nor tortugas. Let's talk about one of the most ironically named places in Florida. The Dry Tortugas are a group of islands about 70 miles west of Key West, and the name makes absolutely no sense anymore. Ponce de Leon discovered them in 1513 and named them Las Tortugas, the turtles, because the islands were covered with sea turtles. He added dry to warn sailors that there was no fresh water available, which was kind of important information back when running out of drinking water meant death. Fast forward 500 years and the turtles have mostly moved on to quieter nesting grounds, but the name stuck. So now you have islands called the Dry Tortugas that are surrounded by water and have very few turtles. The main attraction is Fort Jefferson, a massive brick fortress that was never finished and served as a prison during the Civil War. The whole place is gorgeous, remote, accessible only by boat or seaplane, making it one of the least visited national parks in the country. Fact 35, the oldest city in America. St. Augustine loves to remind everyone that it's the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. And it's not lying. Founded by Spanish explorer Pedro Menendez de Aviles in 1565, St. Augustine predates Jamestown by 42 years and Plymouth Rock by 55 years. While English colonists were still trying to figure out where to land, St. Augustine was already a functioning city with a fort, a church, and a government. The city's location on Florida's northeast coast made it strategically important for Spain's shipping routes, and the Castillo de San Marcos, built in the late 1600s, is the oldest masonry fort in the continental U.S. Walking through St. Augustine's narrow streets feels like stepping into a different era, with Spanish colonial architecture that's actually genuinely old. The whole city is basically a living museum that refuses to let anyone forget it was here first. And honestly, when you're that old, you've earned the right to brag. Fact 34, Lake Okeechobee means big water. The name Okeechobee comes from the Seminole words Oke, water, and Chobe, big. And it's not false advertising. Lake Okeechobee is the second largest freshwater lake entirely within the United States, covering about 730 square miles. But here's what makes it weird. It's incredibly shallow, with an average depth of just 9 feet. It's basically a giant puddle that happens to be the size of a small state. The lake acts as the liquid heart of South Florida, collecting water from the north and slowly feeding it into the Everglades below. It's so important to the region's hydrology that the entire water management system revolves around controlling Okeechobee's levels. Too high and it floods, too low, and everything downstream dries up. The lake is surrounded by a massive dike built after the deadly 1928 hurricane that killed thousands when the lake overflowed. Now the Herbert Hoover Dike keeps the water contained, but it also blocks the view so you can't even see the lake from the shore. Fact 33, the Panhandle gets snow. Nothing breaks a Floridian's brain quite like snow, and yes, it actually happens. While rare, the Florida Panhandle has recorded measurable snowfall multiple times throughout history. Tallahassee has seen snow flurries every few decades, and in 1989, parts of northern Florida got several inches. The sight of palm trees dusted with snow is so bizarre that when it happens, the entire state loses its collective mind. Schools shut down, nobody knows how to drive, and people treat it like the apocalypse. The last significant snowfall was in January 2018 when a winter storm brought flurries across the Panhandle and even as far south as Tampa. The snow usually melts within hours because Florida's geography and climate aren't designed for winter precipitation. But every few years, a cold front dips far enough south to remind everyone that yes, technically, Florida can have winter. It just chooses not to most of the time. Fact 32, Coral Castle's mystery. In Homestead, south of Miami, sits one of Florida's strangest and most mysterious landmarks. Coral Castle is a structure built entirely from massive blocks of oolitic limestone, also called coral rock, that one man carved and assembled by himself. Edward Leeds Kalnin, a 5-foot-tall Latvian immigrant, single-handedly quarried, carved, and moved over 100 tons of stone between 1923 and 1951. Some of the stones weigh multiple tons each, and nobody knows how he moved them. He worked alone, mostly at night, and never let anyone watch him. He claimed to understand the secrets of how the pyramids were built and use some kind of magnetism or leverage system that he never revealed. Engineers and scientists have studied the site and still can't figure out his methods. The stones fit together with incredible precision, and the whole structure stands as a monument to either incredible engineering knowledge or sheer stubborn determination. Leedskalnin built it all for a woman who rejected him, making it possibly the most elaborate response to heartbreak in history. Fact 31. The Big Cypress isn't Cyprus. Here's a naming fail that's lasted for generations. Big Cypress National Preserve sounds like it should be full of massive cypress trees, right? Wrong. The Big Cypress refers to the size of the swamp, not the trees. The cypress trees growing there are actually pretty average-sized, and some areas barely have cypress at all. The 729,000-acre preserve is named for the vast expanse of swampland it protects, which includes cypress strands, pinelands, hardwood hammocks, and prairies. It's an incredibly diverse ecosystem that serves as a crucial buffer for the Everglades and provides habitat for the endangered Florida panther. But the name has been confusing people for decades, leading visitors to show up expecting towering ancient trees, and instead finding a mix of vegetation that includes plenty of non-cypress species. It's like naming a national park Big Mountains and then having it be mostly hills. The whole thing is a geographic misunderstanding that nobody bothered to correct. Fact 30. Florida used to be twice as wide. During the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, Florida looked completely different. When massive glaciers locked up water in the north, sea levels dropped by as much as 300 feet, and Florida's coastline extended much farther out into what's now the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The peninsula was nearly twice as wide as it is today, with the west coast stretching out dozens of miles beyond its current position. Ancient humans and extinct megafauna like mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats roamed across land that's now deep underwater. Divers and fishermen regularly find fossilized bones and prehistoric artifacts miles offshore, proving that what's now ocean was once dry land. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, Florida slowly shrank to its current shape. And with climate change accelerating, it's likely to keep shrinking. The state's geography has always been temporary, constantly expanding and contracting based on how much water is locked up in ice. Florida is basically renting its current shape from the ocean. Fact 29. The Devil's Den is an underground spring. Near the town of Williston in north-central Florida sits one of the state's most surreal natural features. The Devil's Den is a prehistoric spring inside a collapsed karst cave that formed thousands of years ago when the roof of an underground cavern caved in. What's left is a roughly circular opening in the ground that leads down into a crystal-clear pool fed by a constant flow of 72-degree water from the aquifer below. You can scuba dive or snorkel in this underground cathedral year-round, surrounded by ancient rock formations and water so clear you can see straight to the bottom. The opening in the cave's roof lets in shafts of sunlight that create an otherworldly atmosphere. Early settlers named it Devil's Den because on cold mornings, warm air rising from the cave looked like steam, giving the impression that something sinister was lurking below. In reality, it's just one of Florida's many windows into the vast underground river system flowing beneath the surface. But Devil's Den sounds way cooler than mildly warm underground pool. Fact 28. More golf courses than any state. Florida has over 1,250 golf courses, more than any other state in America. To put that in perspective, that's one golf course for every 17,000 residents. The state's year-round warm weather and relatively flat terrain make it perfect for golf, but the environmental cost is staggering. Each course requires millions of gallons of water to keep the grass green, especially during Florida's dry season. They also need constant applications of fertilizers and pesticides that often run off into nearby waterways, contributing to algae blooms and pollution. Huge swaths of natural landscape have been converted into manicured fairways and greens that serve a tiny percentage of the population. From an ecological standpoint, golf courses are basically ornamental deserts that pretend to be nature. But from a tourism and economic standpoint, they're a massive draw that brings in billions of dollars annually. Florida's geography has been reshaped to accommodate people's desire to hit a small ball into a hole, and somehow that's just accepted as normal. Fact 27. The Overseas Highway crosses 42 bridges. Driving from the mainland to Key West on US Route 1 is one of the most spectacular road trips in America, and also one of the most structurally complicated. The overseas highway hops from key to key over 42 bridges spanning 113 miles, making it feel like you're driving on water for 2 hours straight. The most famous is the 7-mile bridge, which does exactly what the name suggests. Stretches for 7 miles over open water with nothing but ocean on both sides. The original highway was built on top of Henry Flagler's old railway route after a 1935 hurricane destroyed the rail line. Some of the bridges are short little connectors between close islands, while others are massive engineering feats that cross miles of open water. The whole route is so exposed that it gets shut down whenever a hurricane approaches, trapping everyone in the Keys or locking them out entirely. It's beautiful, slightly terrifying, and definitely not recommended for anyone with a fear of bridges or water. Fact 26. Crystal River's manatee migration. Every winter, when water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico drop, hundreds of manatees migrate to Crystal River on Florida's west coast. The area has dozens of natural springs that pump out constant 72-degree water year-round, creating warm refuges where manatees gather to survive the colder months. Crystal River is one of the only places in the world where you can legally swim with wild manatees, and it's become a major tourist attraction. The problem is, too much human interaction can stress the animals, even though everyone means well. Manatees are incredibly gentle and curious, often approaching swimmers on their own, but they're also endangered and need protection. The springs are designated as a manatee sanctuary, with rules about how close you can get and strict prohibitions against touching or chasing them. During peak season, you can see 500 or more manatees clustered in the warm spring waters, making it look like a giant aquatic parking lot full of 1,000-pound sea potatoes. It's one of Florida's most magical wildlife experiences, assuming everyone follows the rules. Fact 25. The Conch Republic seceded. In 1982, the U.S. Border Patrol set up a checkpoint on the overseas highway at the last bridge connecting the Keys to the mainland. Their goal was to catch drug smugglers and undocumented immigrants, but the checkpoint created massive traffic jams that killed tourism and infuriated locals. The mayor of Key West, Dennis Wardlow, decided the only reasonable response was to secede from the United States. On April 23, 1982, Key West symbolically declared independence as the Conch Republic, immediately declared war on the U.S. by breaking a loaf of stale Cuban bread over the head of a man in a naval uniform, fought for 1 minute, then surrendered and demanded $1 billion in foreign aid. The whole thing was satire, but it worked. The checkpoint was removed, and the Conch Republic became a permanent, tongue-in-cheek movement, celebrating Key West's independent spirit. The island still celebrates its independence every April, proving that sometimes the best way to fight bureaucracy is with absurdity. Fact 24. Sanibel Island's shell beaches. Sanibel Island, located off Florida's southwest coast near Fort Myers, is famous for having some of the best shelling beaches in the world. The island's unique east-west orientation acts like a net, catching shells from the Gulf of Mexico and depositing them on the beaches in massive quantities. Millions of shells wash up daily, creating beaches that crunch underfoot and attract shell collectors from around the globe. There's even a name for the hunched-over posture people adopt while searching for shells: the Sanibel Stoop. Some mornings after storms, the beaches are so covered in shells that you can barely see the sand underneath. Collectors search for rare specimens like Junonia, lion's paw, and Scotch bonnet shells, treating the activity like a treasure hunt. The island has strict rules about what you can take, and it's illegal to collect live shells with creatures still inside. But empty shells are fair game, and people leave with buckets full of marine souvenirs. It's one of the few places where Florida's geography actively works to give you free stuff. Fact 23. The state sits on an aquifer. Beneath Florida's surface lies one of the largest and most productive freshwater aquifer systems in the world: the Floridan Aquifer. This massive underground reservoir stretches beneath Florida and into parts of Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, holding quadrillions of gallons of freshwater. The aquifer exists because Florida sits on porous limestone that acts like a giant sponge, soaking up rainwater and storing it underground. Nearly all of Florida's drinking water comes from this aquifer, and it also feeds the state's hundreds of natural springs. The problem is, decades of overpumping, pollution, and development have stressed the system. In some areas, water levels have dropped significantly, and sinkholes form when too much water is removed too quickly. Fertilizer runoff, septic tanks, and industrial contamination seep through the porous rock and pollute the water supply. The Floridan aquifer is absolutely essential to life in Florida, but it's being used and abused faster than it can naturally replenish. It's like having a massive underground savings account that everyone keeps withdrawing from without making deposits. Fact 22, Biscayne Bay is mostly national park. Biscayne National Park, just south of Miami, is one of the most unusual national parks in America because 95% of it is underwater. The park protects 172,000 acres of bay, islands, and offshore reefs, making it one of the few places where you need a boat or scuba gear to actually experience most of what's there. The underwater section includes part of the Florida Reef, the only living coral barrier reef in the continental United States, and the third largest barrier reef system in the world. Above water, the park includes mangrove shorelines and a chain of small islands, but the real attraction is below the surface. Snorkelers and divers can explore shipwrecks, swim through coral formations, and see tropical fish, sea turtles, and rays in their natural habitat. The park was created in 1980 to protect the bay from overdevelopment, and it's become a crucial refuge for marine life just miles from one of the largest cities in America. It's proof that even in heavily developed South Florida, wild places still exist if you're willing to get wet. Fact 21, the Suwannee River flows backward. Most rivers in Florida flow south toward the Gulf or the Atlantic, following the gentle slope of the peninsula. But the Suwannee River didn't get the memo. It flows northwest from the Ocefanoke Swamp in Georgia down through North Florida to the Gulf of Mexico, carving through limestone and creating one of the state's most beautiful and ecologically important waterways. The river runs for about 246 miles, cutting through forests, springs, and wetlands that feel more like old Florida than anything near the coast. Stephen Foster immortalized it in the song Old Folks at Home, even though he'd never actually been there, and now it's Florida's official state song. The Suwannee has remained relatively undeveloped compared to other Florida rivers, with long stretches of wild shoreline and dozens of crystal-clear springs feeding into it. Canoeing or kayaking, the Suwannee feels like traveling back in time to a Florida that existed before theme parks and strip malls. It's one of the few places left where the state's natural geography hasn't been completely paved over. Fact 20. Cape Canaveral's Rocket Row. Cape Canaveral wasn't chosen as America's rocket launch site by accident. The location on Florida's east coast is geographically perfect for space exploration. Launching eastward over the Atlantic Ocean takes advantage of Earth's rotation, which spins at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, and gives rockets a free speed boost. The Cape's latitude also provides a good balance between equatorial advantage and accessibility from the rest of the country. But here's the real reason it's perfect. If a rocket explodes during launch, which they occasionally do, all the flaming debris falls harmlessly into the Atlantic instead of onto Orlando or Tampa. The ocean acts as a giant safety net for catastrophic failures. There's also hundreds of miles of empty water for spent rocket stages to drop into without hitting anything important. Since 1950, Cape Canaveral has launched thousands of rockets, and its geography has made it the undisputed capital of American space exploration. Every time you watch a launch, you're seeing geography and physics work together in the most spectacular way possible. Fact 19. The Keys' only fresh water came by pipeline. Living in the Florida Keys sounds romantic until you realize there's no fresh water. The islands are made of porous limestone and coral rock that can't hold groundwater, and rainfall immediately drains away into the ocean. For centuries, residents collected rainwater in cisterns or had it shipped in by boat, which was expensive and unreliable. During World War II, when the military needed a reliable water source for bases in Key West, Engineers built a pipeline in 1942 to pump fresh water 130 miles from Florida City on the mainland all the way down to Key West. The pipeline runs alongside the overseas highway and is still the primary water source for most of the Keys. A few islands now have small desalination plants, but the majority of drinking water still flows through that pipeline. One break, one hurricane, one accident, and the entire island chain loses its water supply. It's a fragile system that makes island life possible, but also highlights how geographically challenging it is to live on a string of limestone rocks in the middle of the ocean. Fact 18. Bok Tower's Singing Hill. In the middle of Florida's relentlessly flat landscape sits Iron Mountain, which at 298 feet above sea level is one of the highest points on the peninsula. And yes, calling it a mountain is generous, but for Florida, it practically counts as Everest. Perched on top of this hill in Lake Wales is Bok Tower Gardens, a 205-foot-tall Art Deco and neo-Gothic tower built in 1929 by Edward Bok, a Dutch immigrant who wanted to create something beautiful for the American people. The tower houses a 60-bell carillon that rings out twice daily in concerts that can be heard for miles across the surrounding countryside. The bells were cast in England and range in weight from 16 pounds to nearly 12 tons, producing a sound that's both haunting and beautiful. The tower and gardens sit in one of the most serene spots in Florida, surrounded by native plants and offering views that stretch for miles. It's a weird, wonderful monument to the idea that even in a state obsessed with theme parks and beaches, someone decided to build a singing tower on a hill just because they could. Fact 17. The Apalachicola Oyster Capital. Apalachicola Bay in Florida's Panhandle is famous for one thing: oysters. The bay produces about 90% of Florida's oysters and roughly 10% of the entire nation's supply, making it one of the most important oyster fisheries in America. The geography here is perfect for oyster cultivation. The Apalachicola River flows into the bay, mixing fresh water with salty Gulf water to create brackish conditions that oysters absolutely love. The river also brings nutrients that feed the microscopic organisms oysters filter and eat. For generations, oyster harvesting was the economic backbone of the region, with boats heading out to the shallow bars where oysters grow in massive clusters. But the fishery has been under stress in recent years. Drought, reduced river flow from upstream water use, and a mysterious oyster die-off have decimated the population. The once thriving industry has collapsed, and oystermen who've worked these waters for decades are struggling. It's a stark reminder that even the most productive natural systems can be disrupted when geography, climate, and human demands collide. Fact 16. Florida has wild monkeys. Yes, Florida has a population of wild rhesus monkeys living in the forest around Silver Spring State Park, and the story of how they got there is peak Florida absurdity. In the 1930s, a tour boat operator thought it would be fun to release 6 monkeys on an island in the Silver River to create a Tarzan-like jungle atmosphere for tourists. Except rhesus monkeys are excellent swimmers, so they immediately left the island and spread into the surrounding forest. Nearly a century later, their descendants are still there, numbering somewhere between 200 and 400 individuals. They're not native, they're potentially carrying diseases like herpes B virus that can be deadly to humans, and wildlife officials have no idea how to deal with them. The monkeys have become part of the local ecosystem, raiding bird nests, eating native plants, and occasionally wandering into people's yards. Efforts to remove them are controversial because, let's be honest, people think monkeys are cute and tourists love seeing them. So Florida just has wild monkeys now, living in Spanish moss-draped forests alongside alligators and panthers, because apparently this state wasn't weird enough already. Fact 15. The St. Johns River flows north. The St. Johns River is one of the few rivers in the United States that flows north, which confuses everyone who thinks rivers are supposed to flow south. The St. John starts in swamps and marshes near Melbourne in Indian River County and meanders 310 miles north to Jacksonville, where it finally empties into the Atlantic Ocean. The river flows north because of the gentle southward slope of the land, which is so subtle that the river barely drops in elevation over its entire length. In fact, the St. John's only drops about 30 feet from source to sea, making it one of the laziest rivers in America. It winds through central Florida, creating a vital waterway that early settlers used for transportation and trade. The river is also incredibly wide in places, more like a series of connected lakes than a traditional river. It's slow, murky, full of alligators, and doesn't care about your geographic expectations. The St. Johns has been central to Florida's development, and its northward flow is just another reminder that nothing in this state follows the rules. Fact 14. Miami's limestone streets. Miami sits on a foundation of oolitic limestone, a porous rock that formed from tiny spherical grains of calcium carbonate that look disturbingly like fish eggs. This limestone is everywhere in South Florida, and it's both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's easy to excavate and has been used as building material for decades. On the other hand, it's full of holes and acts like a sponge, which means water flows right through it. This is why Miami floods so easily. During high tides, seawater pushes up through the porous limestone and floods streets from below, a phenomenon called sunny day flooding, because it happens even without rain. Traditional flood barriers and seawalls don't work because the water just goes under them. As sea levels rise, this problem is getting worse. Some neighborhoods now flood regularly during king tides, and the city is spending billions trying to raise streets, install pumps, and somehow keep the ocean from reclaiming the land. Miami's entire existence depends on holding back water that's seeping up through the ground beneath it. It's a losing battle against geology. Fact 13. The springs pump billions of gallons. Florida has over 700 natural freshwater springs, more than any other place on Earth, and some of them are absolutely massive. Silver Springs, one of the largest, pumps out an average of 550 million gallons of water per day straight from the Floridan aquifer. That's enough to fill about 830 Olympic-sized swimming pools every single day. These springs are windows into the vast underground river system flowing through Florida's limestone foundation. The water emerges crystal clear because it's been naturally filtered through rock, maintaining a constant temperature of around 72 degrees year-round. Springs were vital to early Native Americans and settlers, providing reliable fresh water in a state surrounded by salt water. Today, they're popular swimming and diving destinations, and their constant flow creates entire ecosystems of rivers and wetlands. But many springs are in trouble. Overpumping of the aquifer, pollution, and algae blooms have reduced flow rates and degraded water quality. Some springs that once flowed strongly have slowed to a trickle. These springs are indicators of aquifer health, and right now they're sending a warning. Fact 12. Tornado Alley's eastern cousin. When people think tornadoes, they think Oklahoma and Kansas. But Florida actually has more tornadoes per square mile than any state except Kansas. The difference is Florida's tornadoes are usually weaker, shorter-lived, and born from summer thunderstorms rather than the massive supercells that tear through the Great Plains. Most Florida tornadoes are EF0 or EF1 on the enhanced Fujita scale, meaning they're strong enough to damage roofs and knock down trees but rarely cause the catastrophic destruction seen in the Midwest. They form when sea breezes from the Atlantic and Gulf collide over the peninsula, creating instability in the atmosphere. Florida averages about 12 tornadoes per 10,000 square miles each year, concentrated mainly in the central and southern parts of the state. They pop up quickly, often with little warning, and disappear just as fast. The good news is they're rarely deadly. The bad news is they're unpredictable and can strike any time during the state's long thunderstorm season, which is basically May through October. Just another weather-related hazard in a state already dealing with hurricanes, lightning, and floods. Fact 11. The Peace River's fossil beds. The Peace River in southwest Florida is a fossil hunter's paradise. This slow-moving river meanders through DeSoto and Hardy counties, cutting through layers of ancient sediment that contain fossils from millions of years ago. Wade into the river near Arcadia, and you can find fossilized shark teeth by the handful, some from species that went extinct millions of years ago. Megalodon teeth, sometimes 6 inches long, wash up regularly. You can also find fossils of ancient horses, camels, mastodons, and even giant ground sloths that once roamed Florida during the Ice Age. The river acts like a natural conveyor belt, constantly eroding the banks and river bottom and exposing new fossils. It's one of the best places in the world for amateur paleontology because you don't need special equipment or permission, just patience and a willingness to get wet. The Peace River reveals Florida's deep prehistoric past, a time when the peninsula looked nothing like it does today and was home to creatures that seem impossible. It's a reminder that Florida's geography has been constantly evolving for millions of years. Fact 10. Key West is closer to Cuba than Miami. Here's a geographic fact that explains a lot about Key West's unique vibe. The island sits just 90 miles from Havana, Cuba, but 150 miles from Miami. That means Key West is geographically more Caribbean than American, which is exactly how it feels when you're there. The architecture, the culture, the laid-back attitude, even the weather all lean more toward the tropics than mainland Florida. For centuries, Key West had stronger cultural and economic ties to Havana than to the rest of the United States. Cuban immigrants, Bahamian wreckers, and Caribbean traders shaped the island's identity long before it became a tourist destination. Even today, you can stand at the southernmost point and know that communist Cuba is closer than Disney World. The island's isolation from the mainland created a fiercely independent culture that still exists today. Key West has always operated on its own terms, probably because it's geographically closer to a different country than to the state it belongs to. It's technically Florida, but in every other way, it's its own thing entirely. Fact 9. The Ocala National Forest's Sandhills. The Ocala National Forest in north-central Florida doesn't look like what most people expect from a Florida forest. Instead of swamps and wetlands, you'll find rolling sandhills covered in scrubby vegetation that looks more like a desert than anything tropical. These sandhills are ancient coastal dunes left over from when Florida was mostly underwater, and the current forest area was a beach along a prehistoric shoreline. The soil is pure sand, unable to hold much water, which creates an ecosystem dominated by drought-resistant plants like sand pines, scrub oaks, and wiregrass. It's one of the driest environments in Florida, and it feels completely out of place compared to the rest of the state. The forest covers over 380,000 acres and contains some of the last remaining scrub habitat in Florida, which is critically important for endangered species like the Florida scrub jay. Walking through the Ocala National Forest feels like you've been transported to a completely different state, one where water is scarce and the landscape is harsh and unforgiving. It's a reminder that Florida's geography is way more diverse than beaches and swamps. Fact 8. Hurricane Andrew redrew the map. On August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida as a Category 5 storm and literally changed the landscape. With sustained winds of 165 miles per hour and gusts even higher, Andrew didn't just damage buildings, it erased entire communities. Homestead and Florida City were almost completely destroyed. The storm surge reshaped coastlines, ripped out mangrove forests, and deposited sand and debris miles inland. Trees were stripped bare or snapped like toothpicks, creating fields of shattered wood where forests once stood. Barrier islands were reshaped, beaches were scoured down to bedrock, and wetlands were flooded with salt water that killed freshwater vegetation. More than 63,000 homes were destroyed, and another 100,000 were damaged. The geographic changes were so severe that aerial photos taken before and after the storm showed a completely different landscape. Andrew proved that in Florida, geography is temporary. What hurricanes build up over centuries, they can tear down in hours. The state's coastline, forests, and wetlands are constantly being reshaped by storms. And Andrew was a brutal reminder that nature is still in charge. Fact 7. The Fakahatchee Strand's Ghost Orchids. Deep in the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park, hidden among bald cypress trees and tangled air plants, grows one of the rarest and most mysterious flowers in America, the ghost orchid. This epiphytic orchid has no leaves, appearing to float in mid-air on slender roots, and produces a spectacular white flower that blooms unpredictably and only at night. The ghost orchid is so rare and so difficult to find that its exact locations are closely guarded secrets. It only grows in a few remote swamps in southwest Florida and Cuba, and it can't be cultivated. making it one of the most sought-after plants in the world. People have literally gone to prison for poaching ghost orchids from the Fakahatchee Strand. The most famous case involved John LaRoche, whose arrest was chronicled in the book and film The Orchid Thief. The flower has become a symbol of Florida's wild, untamed places, the kind of landscape that still holds secrets and resists human control. Finding a blooming ghost orchid in the swamp is like discovering a geographic treasure, a reminder that even in crowded, developed Florida, some mysteries remain. Fact 6. Florida's mangrove maze. Florida's coastline is protected by the largest mangrove ecosystem in North America, a tangled labyrinth of twisted roots, brackish water, and impenetrable vegetation. 3 species of mangroves, red, black, and white, create a natural barrier that shields the land from storm surge, prevents erosion, and filters pollutants before they reach the ocean. The red mangrove, with its distinctive arching prop roots, grows right at the water's edge, creating a maze that's nearly impossible to navigate without a boat or kayak. These forests are nurseries for fish, shrimp, crabs, and countless other species that spend their juvenile stage protected among the roots. Manatees, dolphins, and sea turtles cruise through mangrove channels while wading birds stalk the shallows hunting for food. The problem is, mangroves have been massively reduced by coastal development. Shorelines that were once protected by dense mangrove forests are now lined with seawalls and buildings, making them more vulnerable to storms. The remaining mangrove forests, particularly in the Everglades and the 10,000 Islands, are critical to Florida's coastal geography and ecology. They're one of the few things standing between civilization and the full force of the ocean. Fact 5. The Withlacoochee's Double River. Florida has 2 completely separate rivers, both named Withlacoochee, and nobody has ever bothered to rename one of them. The northern Withlacoochee River flows through central Florida from the Green Swamp to the Gulf of Mexico near Yankeetown. The southern Withlacoochee River flows through South Florida in the Everglades region. They're about 200 miles apart, have nothing to do with each other, and yet share the exact same name. The word Withlacoochee comes from the Creek language and roughly means little big water or crooked river, so at least the name is descriptive. But having 2 rivers with identical names in the same state creates endless confusion for anyone trying to navigate, plan trips, or even just talk about Florida geography. It's the kind of lazy naming convention that could only happen in a state where people apparently just gave up on creativity. Other states have managed to come up with unique names for their rivers, but Florida just shrugged and said, let's call them both Withlacoochee and see what happens. It's peak Florida logic, and somehow it's worked for centuries. Fact 4. Miami Beach was mangroves. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Miami Beach, one of the most famous beaches in the world, didn't naturally exist. A century ago, the barrier island that's now Miami Beach was a tangled mangrove swamp that nobody wanted. In the early 1900s, developers decided to transform this mosquito-infested wetland into a luxury beach resort by dredging millions of tons of sand from the bottom of Biscayne Bay and pumping it onto the island. They cleared the mangroves, flattened the land, and created an entirely artificial landscape. The beach you see today, the Art Deco buildings, the palm-lined streets, all of it sits on filled dirt and dredged sand. Even the iconic beach itself requires constant replenishment, because the ocean keeps trying to reclaim the sand. Miami Beach is essentially one of the most elaborate real estate illusions in America, a completely manufactured geography designed to look natural. It's been so successful that most people have no idea they're walking on land that was assembled from scratch. The whole thing is a monument to human ambition and Florida's ability to reshape itself into whatever sells best. Fact 3. The Bermuda Triangle's corner. The southern tip of Florida forms one corner of the infamous Bermuda Triangle, the region of the Atlantic Ocean where ships and planes have mysteriously disappeared over the years. The triangle's other corners are Bermuda and Puerto Rico, creating a massive area that's been blamed for everything from magnetic anomalies to alien abductions. The truth is way less exciting. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the busiest shipping and air traffic corridors in the world, which means statistically, more accidents are going to happen there. The area is also prone to sudden violent storms, rogue waves, and unpredictable weather patterns caused by the collision of warm and cold currents. The Gulf Stream flows through the triangle, which can quickly erase evidence of disasters. The ocean floor drops off into deep trenches where wreckage disappears. When you combine heavy traffic, bad weather, deep water, and strong currents, mysterious disappearances become a lot less mysterious. But the legend persists because people love a good geographic mystery, and Florida's position at the corner of the triangle keeps the story alive. Fact 2, the 10,000 islands aren't numbered. Along Florida's southwest coast between Marco Island and Everglades City lies a maze of mangrove islands known as the 10,000 Islands. Here's the thing, nobody actually knows if there are 10,000 islands. The name is more of an estimate or really just a catchy description that sounds impressive. The islands range in size from a few square feet to several hundred acres, and many are unnamed, uncharted, and constantly shifting as storms, tides, and erosion reshape the coastline. Some islands appear during low tide and disappear during high tide. Others are nothing more than mangrove clumps growing on oyster bars. The labyrinth is so complex that it's easy to get lost even with GPS, and the channels between islands change constantly. Early explorers and fishermen just looked at the endless maze of green and said, "There must be 10,000 of them," and the name stuck. Nobody's bothered to count because it would be impossible. The geography is too dynamic, too complex, too constantly changing to pin down with an exact number. So 10,000 islands it is, give or take several thousand. Fact 1. A state built on bones. Here's the big one. Florida's entire foundation, the limestone bedrock that everything sits on, is made from the compressed skeletons and shells of ancient marine creatures. For hundreds of millions of years, Florida was underwater, and as countless generations of coral, mollusks, foraminifera, and other sea life died, their calcium carbonate skeletons accumulated on the ocean floor. Layer upon layer of dead organisms compacted over time, forming the limestone that eventually rose above sea level to become the Florida Peninsula. So when you're walking around Florida, you're literally standing on billions of dead sea animals. Every building, every road, every beach, all of it rests on an ancient marine graveyard. The limestone is so full of fossilized shells and coral that you can see them embedded in rocks and building materials throughout the state. It's morbid and beautiful at the same time. Florida exists because of death, massive amounts of death accumulated over eons and compressed into stone. The whole state is a monument to the fact that geography is built from the remains of the past, layer by layer, bone by bone. And there you have it. 50 wild facts about Florida you never knew. Can you believe that one state has 2 time zones? Florida is definitely unique. Which fact shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more adventures.